What if the world you know today exists because of a handful of ideas that rarely happened? In this episode, you'll uncover the surprising stories behind 8 inventions that changed human history forever, from Gutenberg's revolutionary printing press to the smartphone in your pocket. Along the way, you'll discover brilliant breakthroughs, unexpected failures, fierce rivalries, and astonishing accidents that transformed everyday life. More importantly, you'll improve your advanced English listening with natural storytelling, authentic C1 vocabulary, and expressions that native speakers use in real conversations. So if you love history, technology, and learning English through captivating stories, you're in the perfect place. Let's begin our journey through the inventions that changed the world.
I'm really excited to get into this today.
Same here. So, I want you, the listener, to just sit with a thought for a second. Imagine your life tonight. No electric lights. No smartphone vibrating in your pocket. Right. The clothes you're wearing right now took a human being, like weeks of back-breaking labor to weave by hand. And if you get a simple paper cut tomorrow, you might genuinely die of an infection.
Yeah, which sounds like dystopian fiction to us now.
It really does. But that was the baseline human reality for, 99% of our history. So today we're doing a deep dive into how a few incredibly messy accidents, stolen ideas, and brilliant engineering leaps dragged us out of the dark.
It's a remarkable progression to chart, really. When you look at the overarching story of human progress, we're basically looking at a series of bottlenecks.
Bottlenecks. Okay, I like that framework.
Yeah, humanity solves one massive limitation, only to just, crash headfirst into an entirely new one. And in dismantling these bottlenecks, we also need to dismantle a very specific, very stubborn myth today.
Which is
the myth of the lone genius.
Oh, yes. This is something I really want to get into. Because we all have this cartoon image in our heads, right? Solitary inventor, sitting in a dark room, having a eureka moment.
Yeah.
Like a lone lightning bolt of genius strikes, and boom, the world is changed. But the more you look at the historical record, that narrative completely falls apart, doesn't it?
Oh, entirely. The reality of invention is just far more chaotic. I mean, it involves borrowing concepts from totally unrelated fields, brutal patent wars, pure luck, and massive, completely unintended consequences.
Yeah, the ripple effects.
Right. Every transformative technology we're going to explore today acts as a double-edged sword. We celebrate the immediate progress, obviously, but society is almost always forced to manage the hidden long-term costs.
So let's look at the first great bottleneck, which is information. We need to go back to a time when knowledge itself had a literal speed limit.
Yes.
Before the 1400s, if you wanted a copy of a book, what was the actual process?
Well, you had to find a scribe, and you had to wait a long time. Monks and professional copyists spent months, sometimes multiple years, just duplicating manuscripts by hand.
Wow.
To put it in perspective, a single Bible took well over a year to complete.
A year for one book. That means knowledge is moving at the literal speed of a human hand.
Yep. And because of that immense labor, the finished product was exorbitantly expensive. Only the wealthiest institutions or royalty could afford one.
Right.
So scholarship moved at an agonizing pace. Not because people in the 1400s lacked curiosity, but just because the physical act of duplication was overwhelmingly laborious.
Right. So imagine being a university student back in the year 1400. You couldn't just download a text or grab it from a library.
No, absolutely not.
You might have to physically travel to a different city just to find a monastery willing to let you look at their single solitary copy. And you definitely couldn't take it home. So humanity hits a wall. Knowledge is too difficult to duplicate.
Enter Johannes Gutenberg.
Right. But wait, he didn't actually invent printing, did he?
He did not.
Yeah.
Chinese inventors had been utilizing woodblock printing for centuries before Gutenberg was even born.
Really?
Yeah. And Korean inventors had already experimented with movable metal type decades earlier.
Wait, if the technology already existed in Asia, why does Gutenberg get the historical credit for inventing the printing press? What did he actually bring to the table?
Well, Gutenberg's true contribution was synthesizing several disparate elements to create a complete functioning system for mass production. First, he developed a mold that allowed for the rapid casting of reusable metal letters. That gave him the durable, uniform type he needed.
Okay, that makes sense.
But then he hit a mechanical hurdle with the ink.
Oh, because the ink they used for handwriting wouldn't work on metal.
Unquestionably the opposite of what he needed, yeah. Traditional watery inks, which worked beautifully on parchment, would simply bead up and pool on the surface of metal type, like water on a freshly waxed car.
Sure, it wouldn't stick.
Right. So Gutenberg had to invent a new oil-based ink that would adhere evenly to the metal. But his third contribution, and this is perhaps the most brilliant leap, was mechanical. He decided to repurpose an agricultural tool.
This is the part that completely fascinates me. He used a wine press.
He did. He looked at a machine designed to crush grapes and realized its underlying mechanics were perfect for his bottleneck.
That's incredible.
Yeah, a wine press operates on a heavy wooden screw mechanism. It applies intense, perfectly even downward pressure. Gutenberg realized that if you placed a piece of paper over inked metal type and cranked down that screw, you could transfer the image flawlessly.
So he essentially borrowed a mechanism from a completely unrelated industry to solve a communications problem. He didn't just invent a machine. I mean, he invented the first physical algorithm for making knowledge go viral. But mechanically speaking, what was the actual impact? Like, how much faster are we talking?
The shift was staggering, truly staggering. Before the printing press, the entire continent of Europe held maybe a few 100,000 handwritten manuscripts in total.
Okay.
Within just 50 years of Gutenberg's first printed Bible, there were an estimated 20 million printed books circulating across Europe.
20 million. That's insane. Ideas that used to spread through this painfully slow trickle suddenly became an absolute flood. I always think of the printing press as an early mechanical version of the internet. It fundamentally altered what it meant to study and build upon the ideas of others. It even allowed Martin Luther's pamphlets to go viral, which basically sparked the Protestant Reformation.
It radically decentralized authority. Scientific data could suddenly be shared across borders in months. Literacy rates climbed because, for the first time, there was affordable material actually worth reading.
But what happens to the man who unleashes that flood? We talked about the myth of the lone genius, but there's also the myth of the wealthy inventor, right? Gutenberg didn't get rich off this, did he?
No, his story is marked by tragic irony, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Gutenberg poured every penny he had into perfecting this system, and he borrowed heavily, mainly from a wealthy merchant named Johann Fust.
Oh, no. Let me guess. The merchant wins.
Unfortunately, yes. Before the workshop could print enough Bibles to turn a real profit, Fust sued Gutenberg for repayment. Gutenberg lost the lawsuit, his workshop, and most of his proprietary printing equipment.
Wow, that's brutal.
It is. Fust went on to profit handsomely from the very machine Gutenberg had spent years agonizing over. It serves as a sobering realization that brilliance and financial success rarely travel together.
That is sobering. So Gutenberg gives us this massive flood of information. Ideas are moving at light speed, relatively speaking. We have the knowledge to build a new world.
Yeah.
But here is the next bottleneck. Human bodies are still stuck moving at the speed of a horse. We have the blueprints for a modern society, but our physical muscle is totally limited. So how do we break that physical limit?
We turn to steam. For nearly all of human history, the amount of work you could accomplish was dictated entirely by biology or geography.
Right, muscle power.
Yeah, your own muscles, the strength of an ox, or you had to be lucky enough to live next to a fast-flowing river or a windy hill to turn a mill.
We were just completely geographically bound, but in the early 1700s, people started to tinker with steam pressure.
Yeah, the first major breakthrough was Thomas Newcomen's engine in 1712. But we must be clear about its limitations. It was incredibly clunky and wildly inefficient.
So what was it actually used for?
One specific dirty job: pumping water out of flooded coal mines in England.
Okay, so it worked well enough to prove the concept had legs, but it wasn't revolutionary yet. What made it so inefficient?
It comes down to basic thermodynamics. In Newcomen's engine, you had a giant iron cylinder. You fill it with steam to push a piston up. But to get the piston to come back down, you had to spray cold water inside that cylinder to condense the steam.
Wait, so you're heating a massive iron cylinder up with coal and then immediately cooling that same metal cylinder down with cold water?
Over and over again.
That sounds like a terrible design.
It was. You lose almost all your thermal energy just reheating the cold metal for the next stroke. It burned through mountains of coal.
So it only made economic sense to use it at a coal mine, where the fuel was literally free.
Spot on. That changes decades later in Glasgow, Scotland. A Scottish instrument maker named James Watt was asked to repair a broken model of a Newcomen engine at the local university.
Okay.
He wasn't trying to trigger an industrial revolution. He was just fixing a broken pump.
But he sees this massive waste of heat. How does he solve it?
Well, Watt realized the cylinder needed to stay piping hot constantly, so he introduced a separate condenser. Instead of cooling the main cylinder, he opened a valve and let the steam escape into a completely separate, constantly cold chamber to condense.
Oh, that's clever.
Yeah, the main cylinder stayed hot, the condenser stayed cold, and fuel efficiency just skyrocketed.
That is a brilliant mechanical leap.
It really was. And later, he added a sun and planet gear system, which converted the up and down pumping action into rotary motion. That was the true game changer.
Because it can turn a wheel now.
Exactly. Suddenly, the engine wasn't just a pump. It could turn wheels, drive massive mechanical looms, and power an entire factory anywhere you wanted to build one, not just next to a river.
But just like Gutenberg, Watt struggled financially with this, didn't he?
He did. He spent years trying to fund his improved engine and getting nowhere, falling deep into debt, actually. His fortunes only changed when he partnered with Matthew Boulton, who was a highly savvy manufacturer.
And Bolton had the money.
Boulton had the capital, yes, but more importantly, he understood the macroeconomic shift. He famously noted that they weren't selling a machine, they were selling power.
Oh, I love that. That partnership takes an elegant engineering solution and turns it into an industrial empire. And the ripple effect is basically the entire Industrial Revolution.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Textile production moved out of individual homes, where it was a slow, handcrafted process, and into massive centralized factories.
Right.
Machines could produce cloth at speeds that would have looked like pure sorcery to the previous generation.
And then we put that steam engine on wheels. We get the railways. In 1830, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway opens. Ordinary people can travel distances in a few hours that used to take days.
Yes.
But there is a fascinating, almost invisible side effect to the railways that I want to talk about. Standardized time zones.
This is a great point. Before the steam engine, every town kept its own local time based on the position of the sun. Noon in London was slightly different from noon in Bristol.
Which is perfectly fine if you're walking or on a horse. But if you have a train moving at 30 miles an hour between cities, how do you publish a timetable?
You can't. A rail schedule simply couldn't function if every station along the line disagreed on what time it actually was.
Right.
So railway companies essentially forced entire nations to synchronize their clocks. One mechanical invention quietly rewrote how humanity measures its days.
It's mind-blowing. But as we said at the start, there are always hidden costs. The steam engine creates enormous wealth, but it also creates the Luddites.
It does.
Now, today, if someone calls you a Luddite, it's usually an insult. Like, it means you don't know how to use your smartphone or you're just stubbornly anti-technology. But historically, I have to push back on that modern narrative. That's not a fair comparison, is it?
It is a profound mischaracterization. Looking at the historical record impartially, the Luddites were organized groups of English textile workers in the early 1800s who smashed the new power looms. But their grievance was entirely rational.
Yeah, they weren't just terrified of shiny new things.
No, not at all. These were highly skilled artisans, people who had spent decades perfecting a craft, who suddenly woke up to find their expertise made entirely worthless overnight.
Because of the machines.
Right. An unskilled worker, perhaps even a child, tending a steam-powered loom could now do their job faster and cheaper.
So their frustration, which definitely did turn violent, was a completely understandable reaction to devastating economic disruption. Their entire livelihoods were being uprooted.
Unquestionably. The steam engine swelled cities with workers seeking factory jobs, forcing them into cramped, unsanitary housing. It redefined the very concept of a workday.
Yes.
It's a vital reminder that technological progress always carries a severe human cost for those caught in the transition. We have to view it objectively.
Well said. So we conquer the physical limitations of muscle with steam. We conquer the limitations of geography with the railway. But humanity is still facing a massive fundamental bottleneck. We are chained to the sun.
Yes, we are.
When the sun goes down, human productivity and social life essentially pause. We had to conquer the dark. Let's talk about electricity and the light bulb.
Try to conceptualize your evening routine tonight without electric light. For the vast majority of human history, candles and oil lamps were the only defense against the dark.
And they weren't great?
They were a flickering, expensive substitute for daylight. They were smoky, dim, and notoriously dangerous. House fires caused by knocked-over lamps were a tragically common occurrence.
So the popular narrative here is so tidy. Thomas Edison sits in his lab in 1879, invents the light bulb, let there be light. But we are busting the lone genius myth today. Edison wasn't the first, was he?
Far from it. Dozens of inventors across Europe and America had already built working incandescent lamps long before Edison's famous demonstration.
Right.
In fact, a British inventor named Joseph Swan had developed a functioning light bulb right around the exact same time, and they eventually had to form a joint company.
Okay, so if Edison didn't invent the fundamental mechanism of the bulb, what was his actual brilliance? Why does his name dominate the history books?
Well, Edison's true brilliance was in macro engineering, a practical, marketable system. He understood that a light bulb is entirely useless without an electrical infrastructure to feed it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so he didn't just iterate on the bulb's design, he designed the power stations, the complex wiring systems that had to safely go into residential walls, the meters to measure how much power a house consumed, and the overarching business model to sell electricity as a utility.
He built the entire ecosystem. But getting the bulb itself to be commercially viable was still a massive, grueling undertaking. I was reading that Edison and his team tested over 1,600 different materials for the filament, the tiny wire inside the glass that actually glows.
They tried everything imaginable: coconut fiber, fishing line, heavily treated cotton, and even hair from a colleague's beard.
Wait, chemically speaking, how does an incandescent bulb actually work? Why do you need a specific filament inside a glass bulb anyway?
It relies on electrical resistance. When you push an electrical current through a very thin wire, the wire resists the flow of electrons.
Okay.
That resistance generates intense heat, and if it gets hot enough, it glows, producing light. But if you do that in normal air, the oxygen will cause the superheated wire to instantly catch fire and burn up.
Ah, so you need the glass bulb to act as a vacuum.
Precisely. You pump the air out of the bulb, creating a vacuum so the filament can reach a blinding white heat without combusting. Edison's team eventually settled on a carbonized bamboo fiber that could burn for over 1,200 hours in that vacuum environment.
That's amazing. And when a journalist later asked Edison if he felt discouraged by those 1,600 failed attempts with other materials, his response was legendary. He said he hadn't failed, he had simply found thousands of ways that didn't work.
It's a great mindset.
I love that so much. It really reminds me of modern software development. You treat failure as a data point to iterate on, not as a defeat. But Edison wasn't just a benevolent tinkerer. He had a pretty ruthless side when it came to protecting his business empire.
He did, which leads us into the War of the Currents. Edison had built his entire sprawling infrastructure around direct current, or DC. But his former employee, Nikola Tesla, who was working with the industrialist George Westinghouse, championed alternating current, or AC.
I hear AC and DC all the time, but conceptually, what is the actual difference?
Think of direct current, DC, like water flowing continuously down a river in one single direction. Alternating current, AEC, is more like the tide. The flow of electrons sloshes back and forth rapidly in the wire.
Why does the sloshing matter for powering a city?
Because of how it interacts with voltage. Since AC sloshes, its voltage can be easily and cheaply stepped up using transformers to incredibly high pressures.
Okay.
This allows it to travel hundreds of miles over thin wires without losing much energy. Then it can be stepped down to safe levels before entering a home.
And Edison's DC couldn't do that.
No, it lost power rapidly over distance, meaning you needed a noisy, polluting power plant every square mile in a city just to keep the lights on.
Wow. Okay, so AC is objectively superior for large grid transmission. But Edison isn't going to just give up his DC empire. What does he do?
He launched an incredibly aggressive, highly publicized smear campaign against AC power. He wanted to convince the public that AC was inherently lethal.
This is the darkest part of his legacy. He literally orchestrated the public electrocution of stray animals using AC power just to terrify the public.
It was very dark.
But hold on, I have to ask. If AC power was visibly that dangerous, and Edison is showing dogs being killed by it, how on earth did Tesla and Westinghouse ever convince the public to let them wire it into their bedrooms? That makes no sense to me.
It is a totally valid question. It really came down to a few major, highly visible victories for Westinghouse. They successfully eliminated the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago using AC power.
Oh, I see.
It was a dazzling, completely safe display that millions witnessed. Shortly after, they won the contract to harness the power of Niagara Falls, successfully transmitting massive amounts of AC electricity all the way to Buffalo, New York.
So seeing is believing.
Right. The sheer economic and logistical superiority of AC eventually outweighed Edison's fear-mongering.
And what happens to Tesla? He's the mind behind this superior AC system. Does he get the Edison-level wealth?
Looking at it impartially, Tesla's story is far more tragic. He was undeniably brilliant, He held over 300 patents, exploring everything from early radio to robotics. He even envisioned wireless power transmission decades before anyone took it seriously.
He was way ahead of his time.
He was. Yet he was famously uninterested in the ruthless business side of invention. He died in relative poverty in a New York hotel room in 1943, while Edison and Westinghouse had built unimaginable wealth.
It's that recurring theme again.
Yeah.
The person who changes the world isn't always the one who captures the financial benefit, but the societal impact of the light bulb is just staggering.
Truly. Factories could suddenly run night shifts, entirely decoupling human productivity from the sun. Cities transformed into much safer places after dark with the advent of electric streetlights. Even basic human sleep patterns shifted as we gained the ability to extend our waking hours well past sunset.
Okay, let's unpack where we are. We have conquered information speed, physical labor, and the darkness. We have literally wired homes and cities for electrical power. And once inventors realized they had this massive network of copper wires connecting buildings, a new question arises, right? What else can we send down those wires?
Exactly. They realized those wires could carry something much more intimate than just electrical power. They could carry the human voice.
Which brings us to the telephone. And this might be my favorite origin story because of how absurd it is. March 1876. A young Scottish-born inventor named Alexander Graham Bell is working in his lab. What happens?
He accidentally spills battery acid on his trousers.
Oh.
Yeah. And in a moment of panic, he shouts to his assistant, Thomas Watson, who is in another room down the hall, "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you."
And Watson hears him, but not through the physical wall. He hears him through an experimental wire connecting their two rooms.
That's right.
The very first sentence ever transmitted by telephone was a plea for help caused by spilled acid. But Bell wasn't actually trying to invent a telephone that day, was he?
He was not. He was working on something called a harmonic telegraph. The telegraph system at the time was facing a bottleneck. You could only send one Morse code message down a wire at a time.
Okay.
Bell was hoping to send multiple messages simultaneously using different audio frequencies.
But Bell had a unique background that other telegraph engineers lacked, which gave him an edge.
His entire professional and personal life revolved around acoustics and speech. His mother was deaf, and his father had developed a system for teaching deaf individuals to speak.
Oh, wow.
Bill himself worked extensively as a teacher for the deaf. This gave him a profound scientific understanding of sound waves and the mechanics of the human voice. He understood the nuances of acoustics in a way a traditional electrical engineer simply wouldn't.
But this is where the fierce rivalry comes in again. Bell wasn't the only one realizing you could send a voice over a wire.
No, the race to patent the telephone was incredibly competitive. An American inventor named Elisha Gray filed a patent caveat, essentially a notice of intent to patent, for a remarkably similar liquid transmitter device on the exact same day that Bell's patent application was filed.
The exact same day. That is a coincidence so suspicious it sounds like a movie plot.
It really does. Historians still debate the granular details of who arrived at the patent office first and whether Bell's lawyers had improper access to Gray's documents. Regardless, Bell won the ensuing legal battle and secured the foundational patent.
But that wasn't the end of the legal fights, was it?
Not at all. His company spent the next several decades locked in a relentless patent war. They faced roughly 600 separate lawsuits from rival inventors and companies.
But Bell's company wins the vast majority of them, and because they defended that patent so aggressively, they essentially built a total monopoly over telephone service.
Yep.
That monopoly grew into AT&T, which became so massive the U.S. government actually forced it to break up in 1984.
The societal shifts driven by the telephone were immediate and profound. Businesses no longer had to wait days for a letter to negotiate a deal across the country. Emergency services became dramatically faster.
Right.
But it also required a quiet rewiring of social etiquette.
How do you mean?
The concept of a disembodied conversation was entirely alien. Humans are visually communicative creatures. Early telephone directories actually had to include explicit instructions on proper phone manners.
Really? Like what?
Well, people had never needed to learn how to speak politely to someone they couldn't physically see, or how to politely end a conversation without physical social cues.
Isn't it wild that every debate we have today about digital communication, whether it's Zoom etiquette or if you should text someone before calling them, all of that traces back to Bell spilling acid on his pants. We're still trying to figure out how to be human through a machine.
It's true. And the early experience was highly mediated too. There were no dial tones or number pads. When you picked up the receiver, you had to speak to a human operator.
The switchboard operators.
Generally young women. They would physically connect your line to the recipient's line using a cable and a plug at a massive switchboard.
Oh, right.
By the early 1900s, tens of thousands of young women had entered the workforce in these roles. It was one of the first widely socially acceptable professional roles for working women, subtly reshaping gender dynamics in the workplace decades before broader societal changes took hold.
That's a massive ripple effect. And we can't leave the telephone without talking about the greatest missed business opportunity in history. Western Union.
Oh, yes. Western Union was the dominant, extraordinarily wealthy telegraph monopoly of the era. When Bell was struggling financially early on, he offered to sell them his telephone patent outright.
And the president of Western Union passes on it. He reportedly calls it an electric toy.
He failed to see past the clunky early prototype to understand the underlying shift in communication. Within just a few years, Western Union realized their catastrophic error and spent millions trying to break into a market that Bell now legally and practically controlled.
It just goes to show how incredibly difficult it is to recognize a world-changing invention when it is sitting right in front of you. Which brings us to our next major bottleneck. The telephone meant you could summon a doctor to your house in minutes. But the terrible reality of the early 20th century was that once the doctor arrived, they often had absolutely nothing they could do to save you.
Bacterial infections were a persistent, terrifying bottleneck for human mortality.
Until the most astonishing accident in the history of science. Let's talk about penicillin, the accidental miracle.
In September 1928, a Scottish bacteriologist named Alexander Fleming returned to his laboratory at St. Mary's Hospital in London after a long summer holiday.
Okay.
Fleming was a brilliant researcher, but notoriously messy. He had left piles of unwashed Petri dishes sitting out on his workbench.
He starts cleaning up, throwing them away, but he notices something weird on one of the dishes.
Right. One of the dishes, which had been growing Staphylococcus bacteria, was contaminated with a blob of blue-green mold. But Fleming noticed something remarkable. There was a clear, transparent ring around the mold where the bacteria simply couldn't grow. The mold was actively destroying the surrounding bacteria.
Most scientists would have just tossed the contaminated dish in the trash and grumbled about a ruined experiment.
But Fleming's curiosity took over. He isolated the mold and identified it as belonging to the Penicillium genus. He discovered that it produced a mold juice, which he named penicillin, capable of killing a wide range of dangerous bacteria without harming human cells.
Okay, wait, how does it actually do that? Mechanically, how does a mold kill a bacteria without hurting the human?
It comes down to cellular architecture. Bacteria have cell walls that constantly need to be rebuilt as they multiply. Penicillin essentially binds to the proteins that the bacteria use to weave those cell walls together. It stops the construction process.
Oh.
So the bacterial cell wall weakens. And because of internal pressure, the bacteria simply bursts and dies. Human cells don't have cell walls. We have cell membranes, so the penicillin ignores our cells entirely.
That is an incredibly elegant biological weapon. So Fleming publishes his findings in 1929, telling the world he found this miracle cure, and what happens?
The paper essentially gathers dust for over a decade. Almost nobody paid attention.
Why? If it's a miracle cure, why didn't the medical establishment jump on it?
Because Fleming was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. He lacked the specialized chemical expertise required to isolate, stabilize, and purify the active penicillin from the raw mold in large enough quantities to be used as a reliable medicine. It remained a laboratory curiosity.
It takes a world war to force the issue.
Yes. In the early 1940s, under the intense, desperate pressure of World War II, a team at Oxford University rediscovered Fleming's research. An Australian pathologist named Howard Florey and a German-born biochemist named Ernst Chain decided to take on the chemistry problem.
But they're doing this in wartime Britain, where everything is rationed.
Their early experiments were comically improvised. They lacked proper laboratory glassware, so they grew the mold in whatever they could find. Old bathtubs, bedpans, milk churns.
And there is a heartbreaking story about their first human trial.
There is. They tested their small, purified batch of penicillin on a local policeman who was dying of a severe infection. And it was caused by a simple scratch from a rose thorn.
A scratch from a rose thorn was a death sentence.
It was. They administered the penicillin, and he showed dramatic, almost miraculous improvement within days. The drug was working.
But
But because they were growing it in bedpans, they simply couldn't produce enough of it. They ran out of the drug, the infection returned, and tragically, the policeman died.
that failure proves the concept, but highlights the manufacturing bottleneck. So how do they scale it up?
Florey traveled to the United States, which wasn't yet fully drained by the war. American pharmaceutical companies collaborated to figure out how to mass produce it, using deep tank fermentation, essentially brewing the mold in massive industrial vats while pumping air through it.
But to make the deep tanks efficient, they needed a stronger strain of the mold. And this brings us to Moldy Mary.
Researchers at a government lab in Peoria, Illinois, employed a lab assistant whose primary job was to scour local markets and bakeries for interesting rotting produce. They were hoping to find a naturally stronger source of the Penicillin mold.
Right.
She returned one day with a rotting cantaloupe.
A moldy melon from a farmer's market in Illinois.
That specific golden mold on that cantaloupe turned out to produce 200 times more penicillin than Fleming's original London strain.
200 times.
And when bombarded with X-rays to mutate it further, production absolutely skyrocketed. Remarkably, nearly every commercially produced dose of penicillin in the world traces its genetic lineage back to that single moldy cantaloupe.
By D-Day in 1944, they had enough penicillin to treat Allied soldiers, saving thousands from battlefield infections. But beyond the war, I want to talk about the psychological shift this caused. You mentioned the policeman dying from a rose thorn.
Penicillin fundamentally lowered the background anxiety of simply being alive. Before antibiotics, a scraped knee on a playground, a splinter from a wooden chair, or the act of childbirth carried a genuine, ever-present risk of fatal sepsis.
Yeah.
People born after the widespread use of antibiotics can barely comprehend the daily low-level terror that previous generations lived with regarding minor injuries.
It is a profound shift in the human experience, and Fleming was incredibly humble about his role in it. He said he didn't invent penicillin, nature did. He just happened to notice it.
He was humble, but he was also deeply prescient. In his 1945 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, Fleming explicitly warned the world.
Warn them about what?
He cautioned that overusing penicillin or taking doses that were too small would train the bacteria. It would allow the surviving microbes to evolve resistance against the drug.
And here we are today, facing antibiotic-resistant superbugs as one of the greatest threats to modern medicine. Every invention is a trade. It solves a bottleneck, but introduces a new vulnerability.
Which transitions us perfectly to an invention that traded geographic isolation for unprecedented physical freedom, but brought its own heavy set of societal consequences. The automobile.
We conquered distance with the railway, but trains only go where the tracks go. You're still bound to a schedule and a specific route. The automobile promised individual, on-demand freedom.
The first true automobile is generally recognized as the Benz patent motor wagon, built by the German engineer Carl Benz in 1885. It had 3 wheels, a small internal combustion engine, and it was viewed by the general public with deep suspicion, if not outright hostility.
Because it was loud, slow, and broke down constantly while they were trying to tinker with it. But the real pioneer of the early automobile wasn't Carl Benz at all. It was his wife, Bertha Benz.
Bertha Benz is a fascinating historical figure. In 1888, she decided to take her husband's prototype on a 66-mile road trip without his prior knowledge.
Why? Just for a joyride?
Partly to prove to her husband that the machine was commercially viable, and partly to generate desperately needed publicity. But the challenges she faced on that journey highlight the total lack of infrastructure. There were no paved roads, no mechanics, and certainly no gas stations.
She had to act as her own pit crew. I read that she unclogged a blocked fuel line using her hat pin. She insulated a worn ignition wire using her garter. And when she ran out of fuel, she had to stop at a local town pharmacy to buy Ligroin, a chemical cleaning solvent, to pour into the engine.
Her journey was a massive success. It proved the vehicle was roadworthy and generated widespread attention. Yet for the next 2 decades, automobiles remained a bespoke plaything for the ultra-wealthy.
Yeah.
They required a mechanical skill set to operate, and a rainy day could leave a wealthy motorist stranded in deep mud on roads meant for horses.
So the bottleneck here is manufacturing. Building a car was a slow, custom process until Henry Ford changes the paradigm. Now, to be clear, Ford didn't invent the car, and he didn't even invent the assembly line, did he?
He did not. Assembly lines have been used in slaughterhouses and firearms manufacturing for years. Ford's crucial breakthrough was perfecting the moving assembly line for large-scale, complex automotive production.
Mechanically, what does that mean?
Before Ford's innovation, a chassis sat on the floor, and skilled mechanics walked around it, building the car, piece by piece. It took roughly 12 hours of skilled labor to build one Model T.
12 hours.
Yeah. But Ford utilized time and motion studies. He put the chassis on a moving conveyor. The car moved past the workers. Each worker stood in one spot and performed one specific, highly repetitive task, tightening a single bolt, attaching one wheel as the car glided by.
So they didn't need to be skilled mechanics anymore. They just needed to know how to turn one wrench.
Precisely. That moving line collapsed the build time of a Model T from 12 hours to about 90 minutes.
And when you slash the time, you slash the cost.
In 1908, a Model T cost around $850. By 1925, driven by the ruthless efficiency of the moving line, the price had plummeted to $260.
Oh, wow.
Suddenly, the automobile wasn't a luxury item. It was within financial reach for the very factory workers who were building them. Ford also made headlines by doubling his workers' wages to $5 a day, recognizing that a well-paid, rested worker made fewer costly mistakes on the fast-moving line and could actually afford to buy the product they were making.
The macroeconomic ripple effects of affordable cars are just endless. It completely restructures society.
It created the modern suburb. You no longer needed to live within a cramped walking distance of your factory job. You could commute. It birthed entirely new secondary industries. Gas stations, motels, drive-in restaurants, paved highway networks.
It even shifted dating culture. Giving young couples a private, mobile living room completely altered the social dynamics that their grandparents lived by. But there is a very dark side to Fordism, both in the factories and with the man himself.
Yes, we must ensure a balanced, impartial view of this era. The moving assembly line democratized consumer goods on an unprecedented scale, but it made factory work psychologically agonizing.
If you've ever seen Charlie Chaplin's 1936 film Modern Times, it captures this perfectly. Chaplin's character is frantically tightening bolts on a fast-moving belt until he essentially loses his mind and becomes caught in the gears.
It was a biting critique.
It really was. It showed how the moving assembly line turned human beings into biological cogs in a machine. The psychological toll of doing the exact same wrist motion every 30 seconds for 10 hours a day was immense.
Furthermore, when evaluating Henry Ford's legacy objectively based on the historical record, we must address his personal actions.
Right.
Alongside his manufacturing breakthroughs, Ford held and actively promoted deeply troubling anti-Semitic views, notably using a newspaper he purchased to mass distribute hateful, conspiratorial material throughout the 1920s.
Which is an uncomfortable but essential historical fact.
It is. Acknowledging the profound impact of an invention does not require us to ignore or excuse the serious flaws of the inventor. We just objectively report what happened.
That is a critical point. The people who reshape our world are complicated, deeply flawed humans. So we paved the physical world to connect our cities with automobiles. We solved the bottleneck of physical isolation. But during the height of the Cold War, a new project began that would connect our minds. Let's look at the internet.
The internet is the perfect counterexample to the lone genius myth. It did not emerge from a single workshop. It evolved gradually from a sprawling, government-funded research initiative. In 1969, the U.S. Department of Defense funded a project called ARPANET.
The goal was to let university research computers talk to each other, but there's always a military angle, right? It was also about building a communication network that could survive a nuclear strike.
That was the foundational architecture. Unlike the telephone system, which relied on centralized switchboards that could be destroyed by a single bomb, ARPANET used something called packet switching.
How does that work?
It chopped data into tiny pieces and sent them through a decentralized web of nodes. If one node was destroyed, the packets would automatically find another route to their destination and reassemble themselves.
It's a brilliant, resilient system. And the very first message sent over this revolutionary network in October 1969 was supposed to be the simple word login. What actually happened?
The system crashed. A researcher in Los Angeles typed the letter L, and it transmitted to Stanford. He typed O, and it transmitted. When he typed the G, the entire system overloaded and died.
So the very first message on what would become the internet was an unfinished thought. Low.
Exactly. And for years after that, the network was just this invisible domain for scientists and the military. It wasn't the internet we know today. It takes another massive leap, which arrives in 1989 with a British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee.
Working at the CERN Particle Physics Laboratory in Switzerland, Berners-Lee was frustrated by a completely mundane bottleneck. Scientists from all over the world were coming to CERN, bringing different computers with different operating systems, and they couldn't easily share their research papers.
So he isn't trying to invent social media or online shopping. He just wants a digital filing cabinet that everyone can access.
To solve this, he invented the World Wide Web. He created the 3 foundational technologies that still run the internet today.
HTML, URL, and HTTP.
Right. HTML, which is the formatting language that tells a screen how to display text and images. The URL, which is the unique address system so you can find a specific page. And HTTP, the protocol that allows the computers to request and transfer that information.
But what makes Berners-Lee's story truly exceptional, maybe the most exceptional decision in this entire deep dive, is what he did next.
He refused to patent it. Berners-Lee and CERN released the underlying source code of the World Wide Web into the public domain completely for free. No royalties, no corporate licensing fees, no ownership.
Think about the alternative reality for a second. What if the foundational architecture of the web had been locked behind a corporate paywall from day one?
It's terrifying.
What if every time someone built a website, they had to pay Tim Berners-Lee a fraction of a cent? It almost certainly would have stifled the explosive, chaotic, permissionless growth that defined the early web. By giving it away, he allowed anyone with a computer to become a publisher.
But the early culture of the internet was so radically different from the sleek apps we use today.
Oh, it was built by hobbyists and academics. Websites were hand-coded, featuring garish neon colors and flashing text.
Oh, there's colors.
Yeah, and connecting to the network meant using a dial-up modem that made a famously loud, screeching mechanical sound as it negotiated a connection over the copper telephone wires.
And getting online meant you had to negotiate with your family, because tying up the computer meant nobody could use the house phone.
There was also immense skepticism from brilliant people who simply couldn't see past the clunky early phase.
Yeah.
In 1995, a respected astrophysicist and early internet pioneer named Clifford Stoll wrote a famous magazine column predicting the web would be a passing fad.
Wow.
He argued that it would never replace physical newspapers, that people would never buy things online, and that the sheer chaos of uncurated information would render it useless.
It's easy to laugh at that now, but it goes back to what we said about Western Union. Transformative inventions rarely look transformative in their infancy. They look like electric toys.
Without a doubt. The late 90s brought the dot-com boom, followed by a massive, catastrophic market crash in the year 2000. Trillions of dollars in speculative market value evaporated.
But it didn't end there.
No, the underlying physical infrastructure, the miles of fiber optic cables laid across the ocean floors, remained. The seeds of the modern tech giants survived the wreckage, proving that a genuinely transformative technology will outlive its own hype cycle.
I want to bring this back to our first bottleneck. Gutenberg. Isn't Tim Berners-Lee just reimagining Gutenberg's original mission?
It is a profound parallel. Gutenberg built a physical system to get information into as many hands as possible, bypassing the gatekeepers of the monasteries.
Right.
Berners-Lee built a digital system to do the exact same thing, bypassing traditional media publishers. Gutenberg repurposed a wine press. Berners-Lee repurposed a Cold War military network. But the philosophical goal was identical: the democratization of information.
Which brings us to the final bottleneck in our journey today. We have this massive global network of information. We have all the previous inventions, electricity, the telephone, the camera, but they're all separate, heavy, and stationary. The final step was taking all of human knowledge and shrinking it down to fit into your pocket. The smartphone.
The device you're likely using to listen to us right now. The smartphone is entirely unique in the history of invention because it did not just solve one narrow problem. It was a convergence device. It swallowed dozens of earlier standalone inventions whole.
Now, Apple usually gets all the credit here, but the first true smartphone actually came from IBM, didn't it?
Yes. In 1994, IBM released a device called Simon. It was remarkably forward-thinking. It had a touch screen, it could send emails, it had a calendar and an address book.
Oh, wow.
But it completely failed in the marketplace.
Why? If it was that far ahead of its time?
Because it was a victim of its surrounding infrastructure. The mobile internet networks of 1994 were abysmally slow and unreliable. The device itself was bulky, the battery life was terrible, and it was incredibly expensive. It quietly disappeared because the ecosystem wasn't ready to support it.
It wasn't until 2007 that Apple's iPhone fundamentally redefined the category. And Steve Jobs' presentation was brilliant because he didn't introduce it as a convergence device at first.
Right.
He stood on stage and said he was introducing 3 new products: a widescreen iPod, a revolutionary mobile phone, and a breakthrough internet communications device. And he just kept repeating it until the audience realized he was talking about one single piece of glass.
The seamless convergence was the revolution.
Yeah.
Think about the historical breakthroughs the smartphone absorbed. It took the camera, which traces its lineage back to Louis Daguerre in the 1830s. It took the compass, originating in ancient China.
Yeah.
It took recorded music, born from Edison's phonograph, and of course Bell's telephone. Each of those required a massive leap of human ingenuity, and the smartphone gathered them all under one glass roof.
And it also absorbed technologies we didn't even know we needed, like GPS. The origin of smartphone GPS is a crazy story.
It really is. The Global Positioning System was originally a highly classified, military-only satellite navigation network built by the U.S. Department of Defense. It was never intended for civilian use.
So how did it end up in our phones telling us where to buy a cup of coffee?
It was a reaction to a geopolitical tragedy.
Yeah.
In 1983, a Korean Airlines passenger jet strayed off course into restricted Soviet airspace and was shot down by the Soviet military, killing everyone on board.
Oh, that's awful.
In the aftermath, President Ronald Reagan issued a directive to make the military's GPS system available for civilian aircraft to ensure a navigational error like that could never happen again.
And from there, it eventually trickles down into consumer electronics. But the hardware of the smartphone was only half the revolution, wasn't it?
The true societal shift arrived a year after the iPhone launched, with the introduction of the App Store in 2008.
Why is the App Store the real revolution?
Because before 2008, a phone was a closed system. You bought a phone, and you were stuck with whatever calculator or calendar the manufacturer decided to install.
Right.
The App Store flipped the model. It allowed any independent software developer anywhere in the world to write a program and distribute it instantly to millions of devices.
It turns the phone from a specific tool into a blank canvas. And it launched entirely new, multi-billion-dollar industries overnight. Ride-sharing apps uprooted the taxi industry. Food delivery apps changed restaurants. Mobile banking changed global finance.
The staggering pace of adoption in developing nations is particularly notable. It took many decades for electricity and landline telephones to reach a majority of homes globally. But smartphones achieved massive global penetration in roughly a single decade.
That's incredibly fast.
Developing regions were able to leapfrog older technologies entirely. They didn't need to spend billions laying copper telephone wires across a continent. They just built cellular towers. In many parts of the world, a cheap Android smartphone has given millions of people their first ever access to formal banking, education, and global markets.
But we always have to come back to the hidden costs. We said at the beginning that every technology is a double-edged sword, and we are currently living through the deeply complicated consequences of the smartphone era.
I draw a direct analytical parallel here to the Industrial Revolution. Just as society in the 1920s had to grapple with the realities of factory work, Fordism, and urban sprawl, we are currently grappling with the psychological trade-offs of massive, relentless digital connectivity.
The bottleneck we solved was access to information and people, but the new bottleneck we created is human attention.
Precisely. The design techniques used in many modern applications borrow heavily from the behavioral psychology of casino slot machines. They rely on intermittent variable rewards.
Wait, explain that. What is an intermittent variable reward?
It is a psychological mechanism where you receive a reward like a notification, a like, or a new piece of interesting content, but you don't know exactly when it will arrive or how big the reward will be.
Okay, I see.
It is the exact same psychological hook that keeps someone pulling the lever on a slot machine. You pull down to refresh your social media feed, not knowing if you'll see something boring or something highly stimulating. That unpredictability is highly addictive to the human brain.
So they are purposely engineered to capture and hold our attention for as long as possible. It creates an almost constant low-level distraction that previous generations simply never had to manage.
We are seeing the measurable impacts on attention spans, mental health, and the polarization of political discourse. The tech companies acknowledge this tension by introducing features like screen time trackers, but there is a fundamental conflict of interest.
Right, because of ads.
Their core business models still rely on maximizing the very attention those tracking tools are meant to protect. We are a generation that has grown up inside a powerful new tool, and we are only just beginning to understand the deep psychological consequences.
It really makes you stop and think. I want to ask you, the listener, to reflect on this for a second. Think about that device in your hand or your pocket. Think about the slot machine psychology and the apps you use daily. How much of your daily attention is being carefully managed by a machine that swallowed 100 other machines? It is a heavy thing to process.
It is a profound shift in the human condition. And if we pull back to synthesize everything we have covered in this deep dive, the overarching theme of history is remarkably consistent. Invention is rarely a lone lightning bolt of genius. It is a very long, messy, collaborative relay race.
Gutenberg borrowed the physics of a wine press to build his printing press. James Watt improved a clunky steam engine that Thomas Newcomen had built decades earlier. Alexander Fleming got lucky with a dirty petri dish, but it took a world war and a moldy cantaloupe to make it a medicine.
Yes.
Tim Berners-Lee built the web, but he depended entirely on the military infrastructure of ARPANET, and then he made the choice to give his work away for free.
And every single one of these transformative leaps was a complex trade.
Yeah.
The steam engine created unprecedented wealth, but violently uprooted skilled workers.
Right.
Penicillin saved millions, but initiated an arms race with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. The internet connected the globe, but amplified misinformation and fractured our attention. Society is almost always left paying off the hidden costs long after the original inventor is gone.
Which brings us back to the premise we started with. We have dismantled the lone genius myth. These objects, these systems were not inevitable. They did not have to happen the way they did.
No, they didn't.
They were the result of intense curiosity, fierce rivalry, stolen ideas, and the persistence of deeply flawed humans who chose to investigate the unexpected rather than throw it away.
They observed the bottlenecks of their era, and they tinkered until something broke through.
And that leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over. Look around you right now. Look at the ordinary objects, the digital systems, the mundane routines you interact with daily. None of them were inevitable. So here's the provocative question. What invisible system or invention are we living through right now, perhaps something we barely even notice, that future generations will look back on as our era's printing press?
That is a remarkably potent question to leave hanging in the air.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the messy, fascinating reality of invention. We hope you've gained some valuable insights, understood the mechanisms behind the history, and picked up some fantastic new vocabulary along the way. Before you go, we have one small favor to ask. Please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to this YouTube channel so you never miss an exploration like this one. Until next time, keep questioning the world around you.
Farewell, and keep learning.